What does it mean to call something ancient? We imagine ruins, dust, broken inscriptions, the hush of museums. We think of the distant past as a place softened by time, where even suffering becomes abstract. But some histories do not stay buried so easily. Some return not as legends, but as evidence. A cut in bone, a trace of poison, a body preserved too well, a record written in the language of repetition. Long before the modern laboratory, long before clinical trials and ethics boards and glass vials arranged beneath electric light, human beings were already testing the limits of flesh, fear, and survival. They did not use our vocabulary. They spoke instead through ritual, medicine, kingship, punishment, devotion. Yet beneath those names was something hauntingly familiar: observation, adjustment, comparison. A question asked once is curiosity. A question asked again and again, with the body as proof, becomes something else. This is a story about that threshold. Across deserts, temples, courts, arenas, and mountain chambers, people searched for answers to the oldest problems we know. How do we stop decay? How do we outwit poison? How do we understand pain, consciousness, injury, healing, death? Sometimes those searches were sacred. Sometimes they were practical. Often they were both. And almost always they came at a cost carried by unnamed lives. What survives in history is usually the finished result: the intact mummy, the refined antidote, the surgical technique, the relic that seems to defy time. What fades is the long corridor of failed attempts behind it, the hands that experimented in secrecy, the bodies that did not endure, the silence around what was learned and how. So before we begin, perhaps the real question is not how advanced the ancient world was. It is how much it was willing to risk in order to know. What if the first laboratory was not built of glass, but of stone? Along the western bank of the Nile, where desert light hardens every edge and evening falls like a curtain of bronze, the ancient Egyptians learned to look at death with unusual patience. We often remember mummification as a sacred act, a ritual of kings and priests meant to prepare the soul for eternity. And it was that. But beneath the prayers and painted coffins, there are signs of another impulse at work. Not worship alone. Refinement. The evidence does not point to a single perfected tradition arriving fully formed. Early mummies vary dramatically. Some remain strikingly intact, their features still gathered around the skull with an eerie calm. Others seem to have collapsed from within, the skin drawn tight over a body that lost its structure too quickly. That inconsistency tells a quiet story. It suggests trial, failure, adjustment. Someone was learning. Imagine a sealed chamber near Thebes, oil lamps flickering against plaster walls, linen stacked in careful folds, bowls of resin, oils, natron salts, a body laid out not only for ceremony, but for procedure. One incision made smaller than the last, one drying period extended by several days, one mixture of resin altered to seal moisture out more completely, then another body, then another. Months later, the results examined in silence. This is where the sacred and the empirical begin to overlap. To preserve a person so completely, embalmers had to understand what decay touched first. They had to notice how heat changed tissue, how trapped air hastened ruin, how certain compounds stiffened skin, while others sealed too early and held dampness inside. These are not abstract insights. They come from contact, repetition, and memory, from noticing what worked and what failed. And perhaps that is the unsettling intimacy of this history. The Egyptians were not merely honoring the dead. They were studying how the dead changed. They were learning body by body how to interrupt time itself. The mummy we see in a museum feels like a finished miracle. But every miracle of preservation may have begun as an experiment in uncertainty. And in that dim space between devotion and discovery, one question lingers. How much did they learn about life by mastering the slow mechanics of death? How far would a ruler go to escape death? Far enough, it seems, to drink it. In the court of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, immortality was not a metaphor. It was a state project. Messengers were sent in search of sacred mountains and hidden islands. Alchemists were summoned with promises of reward and the threat of ruin. Physicians worked beneath imperial pressure, blending minerals and metals into formulas meant to defeat time. Among them shimmered one substance above all others, mercury, bright as liquid moonlight, seductive in its mystery, fatal in its truth. To the ancient imagination, mercury must have seemed almost supernatural. It moved like water, yet was metal. It reflected the world without becoming part of it. It appeared alive. In a culture shaped by cosmology, symbolism, and the dream of balance between earthly and celestial forces, it is not hard to see why such a material became linked to longevity. But belief alone does not explain what happened next. The formulas changed. Dosages shifted. Reactions were observed. That is what makes this story feel less like superstition and more like an early chemical trial unfolding inside the machinery of power. The emperor reportedly suffered tremors, agitation, sleeplessness, and instability before his death. Later accounts may embellish, but modern toxicology recognizes the pattern immediately. Mercury attacks the nervous system. It alters mood, coordination, judgment. What ancient scribes described in moral or political terms may also have been a body recording its own poisoning in plain sight. And still the search continued. Near the emperor's mausoleum, elevated mercury levels in the soil remain one of archaeology's most chilling details. Symbolically, the tomb was said to contain rivers of mercury flowing beneath the earth like a miniature empire suspended in metal. Yet symbolism has a way of hiding practice. The same substance used to imagine eternity may also have shaped a grim knowledge of dosage, tolerance, and decline. Here, the pursuit of immortality became a study in collapse. Every adjustment to the elixir carried a question. Will this preserve life or shorten it? No one in that court could have answered with certainty, but they kept testing. And perhaps that is the darker mirror of human ambition. We do not always destroy ourselves by accident. Sometimes we do it methodically, in pursuit of something radiant. If the emperor wanted forever, what he found instead was a lesson written in poison. The line between cure and catastrophe is often discovered only after the body has crossed it. What can a body reveal once fear gives way to attention? In ancient Greece, medicine began to shift from omen to observation. Illness was no longer explained only through the moods of gods or the moral failings of men. Somewhere in that change, a different habit emerged. To watch carefully, to compare cases, to describe what was seen rather than what tradition insisted must be true. It was a quiet revolution, and it often took place in the shadow of death. The plague that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War must have made abstraction impossible. Bodies failed too quickly. Symptoms did not arrive in neat order. Fever, bleeding, thirst, exhaustion, delirium. To confront such disorder, early physicians had to become record keepers of suffering. They noted progression. They distinguished one pattern from another. They tried to understand why some wounds killed swiftly while others lingered, why some fevers spread like fire and others seemed to drown the body from within. This was more than philosophy. It was contact with the interior. Although public dissection remained culturally fraught, war and epidemic opened accidental doors into anatomy. A battlefield injury could expose layers of muscle in an instant. A plague victim could reveal the swollen violence of disease beneath the skin. In time, Greek medical writing began to sound less mystical and more tactile. Organs were described by texture, weight, and position. The chest could fill with fluid. The spleen could enlarge. The brain, once neglected in older systems of thought, began to appear as something central to sensation and disturbance. What changed was not simply knowledge, but method. Once physicians start comparing one body to another, once they classify rather than merely react, medicine enters a new moral landscape. The dead and dying become teachers. Every wound contains instruction. Every fatal case adds a line to an emerging map of the human form. It is difficult to imagine the foundations of Western medicine without this turn toward direct examination. And yet that examination required intrusion into spaces once guarded by taboo. So the Greek achievement carries a paradox still familiar today. Healing advanced because someone was willing to look more closely at damage, decay, and mortality than custom had once allowed. Compassion and curiosity move together, but not without tension. And perhaps that tension never disappears. The body can answer extraordinary questions, but only when someone dares to open what reverence once told us to leave untouched. When knowledge begins with the wounded, the dying, and the dead, where exactly does understanding end and trespass begin? What if the fear of poison could turn a king into a chemist? In the kingdom of Pontus, where cliffs fell toward the Black Sea and political loyalty could vanish overnight, Mithridates VI lived with a ruler's most intimate terror. That death might arrive not on a battlefield, but in a cup. Assassination by poison was not paranoia in the ancient world. It was strategy, silent, elegant, difficult to trace. And so Mithridates chose an answer as obsessive as the threat itself. If poison could kill him, perhaps poison could also teach him how not to die. He began, according to later accounts, with tiny doses. A little arsenic, a little hemlock. Plant extracts known for paralysis, delirium, collapse. The amounts were measured and repeated, then increased as his body endured them. Symptoms were watched closely. Nausea, tremors, flashes of strength, spells of weakness. Somewhere in that cycle of exposure and recovery, the king and his physicians began assembling a dangerous kind of knowledge. Not a cure in the modern sense, but a pattern. This amount weakens. That amount kills. This herb softens the blow. That compound sharpens it. Fear became protocol. There is something almost modern in the logic, even if the setting remains ancient. Adjust the dose, record the effect, refine the mixture. Over time, this effort gave rise to Mithridatium, a compound so famous that its legend outlived the kingdom itself. It passed into Roman hands, then through centuries of medicine, transformed and preserved because people believed it worked often enough to matter. Yet any antidote built this way casts a long ethical shadow. A king could use his own body as proof of concept, but power rarely experiments on itself alone. Prisoners, slaves, and the condemned likely stood just beyond the edge of the record, absorbing the danger that made refinement possible. They remain almost invisible in history, though their suffering may have shaped the formula as surely as the king's survival did. The most haunting detail arrives at the end of Mithridates' life. Defeated, cornered, he reportedly tried to take poison and found that it no longer worked. The body he had trained against death refused the exit it once feared. In the end, another man's sword had to complete what chemistry could not. It is a story both brilliant and tragic. To survive, Mithridates entered into a long negotiation with harm. And maybe that is the lesson beneath the legend. Sometimes the line between protection and self-destruction is so thin that only history, looking back, can see which side a person was truly on. What did Rome see when it looked into the arena? The crowd saw spectacle. The state saw order. A physician may have seen the body opened by force, revealing its secrets in real time. When the Colosseum rose over Rome, it announced imperial confidence in stone. But beneath the noise of the crowd and the choreography of combat, gladiatorial violence produced something else. Repetition. Certain fighters met certain opponents. Specific weapons created predictable injuries. Armor protected one region while exposing another. Wounds were not random. They followed patterns. And patterns invite study. In the gladiator schools, survival had value. These men were expensive to train and profitable to display. A dead fighter could stir the crowd once. A healed fighter could return again and again, carrying scars like a record of past encounters. That economic logic gave Roman medicine an unusual advantage. Physicians attached to gladiatorial schools did not simply treat cuts and fractures. They observed trauma under controlled conditions. They learned which strikes severed muscle without reaching the organs, which punctures bled fast enough to kill before help arrived, which injuries to the spine stole movement from the limbs. The body became visible through violence. Galen, one of Rome's most influential physicians, gained part of his experience tending injured gladiators. His later anatomical and surgical insights did not emerge from theory alone. They were shaped by repeated contact with torn flesh, exposed tendons, shattered bone, and the astonishing resilience of those who somehow recovered. Even diet became part of the system. Fighters were fed deliberately, conditioned carefully, monitored for strength and repair. The Roman arena did not merely display human endurance. It cultivated and measured it. That is what makes this history difficult to look at directly. The knowledge that helped later medicine grow may have come in part from organized harm. Techniques for stopping blood loss, understanding nerve damage, setting fractures, and distinguishing survivable wounds from fatal ones were sharpened not in peace but in performance. The arena was public, but its lessons were absorbed quietly. Once the games faded, the brutality was easier to condemn than the knowledge was to discard. And perhaps that is the enduring discomfort of Rome. Progress did not arrive untouched by cruelty. It often rode beside it. In the bright heat of the amphitheater, where thousands watched men struggle for breath, the empire may have been learning not only how bodies break, but how they can be pulled back from the edge. When science grows in the shadow of spectacle, can we separate the healing that followed from the violence that first made it visible? What if a vision could be summoned, not by chance, but by design? In the Maya world, blood was never only blood, it was memory, lineage, covenant, breath made visible. On carved stone monuments, rulers appear poised in ritual stillness, drawing cords through the tongue or piercing the body with obsidian and stingray spine. To modernize, the images can feel almost unbearable. Yet for the Maya elite, this was not simply pain for its own sake. It was a deliberate crossing point, a way to enter a state where the ordinary world loosened and something beyond it seemed to speak. The ceremony was structured with remarkable care. It took place in temple spaces shaped by shadow, incense, and echo. It was timed to celestial cycles, bound to dates of dynastic meaning, framed by expectation and symbolism. But alongside its sacred language, there is another pattern hiding in plain sight: repetition. The rituals were performed again and again across generations. The tools remained specialized. The settings remained controlled. The effects were anticipated. After blood loss, fasting, smoke, and silence, visions were expected to come. This is where spirituality and physiology begin to touch. Modern medicine can describe what the Maya did not need modern language to know. Moderate blood loss can produce weakness, dizziness, and altered perception. Fasting intensifies the body's sensitivity. Incense changes the atmosphere. Ritual concentration narrows the mind. Together, these forces can open a threshold where sensation feels sharpened and unreal at once. A voice, an image, a serpent in smoke. To the participants, this was revelation. To us, it may also look like an early and disciplined engagement with the body's capacity to alter consciousness. That possibility does not diminish the ritual. It deepens it. The Maya were expert observers of cycles, seasons, stars, eclipses, intervals of time so precise they still astonish us. It is not difficult to imagine that they also noticed patterns in the human body. How much deprivation changed perception? How long after bleeding the visions tended to come? Which combinations of setting and expectation made the unseen feel closest? And so the ritual becomes more than devotion alone. It becomes a study in how the body can be guided toward transcendence. But the question remains unsettled. If an altered state is induced through careful strain, is it less sacred or simply more human? Perhaps the ancient Maya understood something we still struggle to name, that the body is not a barrier to mystery, but one of its oldest instruments. How does a civilization learn the difference between medicine and poison? Often by walking the narrow ground where the two are almost the same. In the markets and temple precincts of the Aztec world, plants were more than food or ornament. They were instruments of transformation. Some soothed pain, some sharpened the mind, some brought sleep, confusion, paralysis, or death. The people who gathered, traded, and prepared these substances were not dealing in vague mystery. They were dealing in effects. This leaf numbs, that root weakens. A small amount alters the body one way, a larger amount alters it another. Knowledge like that does not appear all at once. It accumulates, and accumulation implies testing. The Aztec pharmacological tradition was rich, practical, and closely tied to power. Healers understood remedies, but imperial systems also understood control. A substance that could calm pain might also immobilize a captive. A mixture that eased the body into sleep might, in stronger form, become an invisible weapon. In that overlap, botanical knowledge gained a double edge. The healer and the executioner could be standing much closer to one another than history prefers to admit. Spanish chroniclers, despite all the distortions of conquest, preserve glimpses of a world filled with carefully classified plant substances. They describe preparations with specific outcomes, dosages that mattered, and effects that were expected rather than guessed at. Even allowing for exaggeration, the pattern is clear enough. The Aztecs were not merely surrounded by potent plants. They had learned to organize what those plants could do. That organization required bodies. Some of the knowledge must have come from healing the sick and observing how they responded. Some likely came from ritual contexts where altered states and physical control mattered, and some may have emerged from punishment, coercion, or the management of prisoners. The archive is incomplete, but the logic of toxicology survives in fragments. Below one threshold, a substance changes sensation. Above another, it interrupts life itself. This is what makes the Aztec record so haunting. It suggests a society that understood chemistry not through abstract formulas, but through close attention to consequence. They watched what happened. They adjusted. They remembered. And perhaps that is the oldest lesson of pharmacology. Every remedy carries a shadow version of itself. The same plant that heals in one measure can destroy in another. When knowledge is built inside that fragile balance, the real question is never only what a substance is. It is who decides how far its power will be taken. What does it mean to repair a face? Not simply to restore flesh, but to return a person to the world. In ancient India, where law, medicine, and social identity often intersected with brutal force, the loss of a nose could mean more than injury. It could mark punishment, shame, exclusion. And from within that difficult reality emerged one of the most remarkable chapters in surgical history, the attempt to rebuild what violence had taken away. The procedures described in the tradition of Sushruta do not read like vague hopes. They read like instructions shaped by practice. A leaf was used as a template. The missing shape was measured first, then transferred to living skin, often from the forehead or cheek. The flap remained partly attached so blood could continue to nourish it. It was turned carefully, stitched into place, supported so the nostrils would not collapse as healing began. Even now, the elegance of the logic feels striking. It reveals an understanding of tissue survival that could only have come from repeated attempts, close failures, and gradual success. This was surgery born from necessity, but refined by observation. The texts attributed to Sushruta describe instruments with purpose and precision: blades for cutting, forceps for holding, tubes for preserving shape. There are warnings about swelling, discoloration, poor incision depth, and tissue death. Such details do not come from imagination alone. They come from bodies that healed badly, from grafts that darkened and failed, from patients who became lessons in what not to do next time. And yet this is not a story of cruelty disguised as knowledge. It is more intimate than that. Unlike the poison trials of kings or the spectacle of the arena, reconstructive surgery aimed to restore dignity. Its risks were real, but its purpose leaned toward mercy. Even so, compassion did not remove uncertainty. Pain relief was limited. Infection was poorly understood. Every operation carried danger. To attempt repair under those conditions was to step into the unknown with skill, nerve, and hope. Centuries later, European surgeons would marvel at these Indian methods and adapt them into modern reconstructive practice. But by then, the long chain of unnamed patients who made refinement possible had already vanished into time. Perhaps that is the quiet truth at the heart of medicine's most humane achievements. Even healing has a prehistory of trial. The restored face that seems miraculous in hindsight may have been purchased through many fragile attempts to understand how the body accepts being made whole again. When surgery is driven by compassion but shaped through uncertainty, where exactly do we place the boundary between care and experiment? What do we do with a place that history cannot fully explain? At Carthage, beneath open sky and layers of ash, archaeologists uncovered row upon row of small urns. Each held the cremated remains of infants or very young children. Above them stood carved stones bearing the names of families, invocations to deities, symbols worn smooth by time. It is one of the most unsettling landscapes the ancient world has left behind. Not because it offers certainty, but because it refuses it. Ancient enemies of Carthage claimed the site proved ritual sacrifice. Modern scholars have pushed back, arguing that hostile empires often exaggerated the cruelty of those they sought to defeat, and yet the earth remains difficult to dismiss. The burials were not random. They were patterned, repeated, organized. The children were placed within a ritual framework that continued across generations. Whatever happened there, it happened methodically. That is what gives the Tophet its disturbing gravity. This may have been a place where grief and devotion merged under unbearable conditions. In the ancient world, infant mortality was common, relentless, almost expected. Families lived close to the possibility of loss. It is possible that the Tophet gave sacred structure to that reality, transforming private sorrow into communal offering. But another possibility lingers beside it, that some children were not only mourned there, but chosen there, folded into a system that gave death a ritual purpose. The evidence does not resolve the question cleanly. Some remains suggest illness or frailty, others do not. Cremation methods appear strikingly consistent, as if guided by practice rather than improvisation. Inscriptions create an official tone, almost administrative in its calm. This was not chaos, it was order applied to mortality. And when a society organizes death with such precision, we are forced to ask what kind of logic lies underneath. Religious belief? Demographic pressure? Social necessity wrapped in sacred language? Perhaps all three. The Tophet stands at the edge of what archaeology can say and what imagination must not invent too carelessly. But it still leaves us with something essential. It reminds us that ancient people did not simply endure death, they built systems around it. They gave it ritual, sequence, names carved into stone. Whether that system was born from reverence, desperation, or sacrifice, it turned loss into pattern. And maybe that is why the site still unsettles us. Not because it shows death in the ancient world, but because it shows how easily human beings can normalize what would otherwise be unbearable once repetition gives it form. What if the greatest experiment was not performed on another body, but on one's own? In the mountains of northern Japan, where winter silence gathers in cedar forests and temples seem to lean inward toward stillness, a small number of Buddhist monks pursued a discipline so severe it almost resists language. Over years, they stripped the body down to its barest possibility. Nuts, seeds, bark, roots, then less. Then poison drawn from lacquer sap, enough to drive out parasites and leave the body increasingly hostile to decay. Finally, a narrow underground chamber, barely large enough to sit in, where breath continued through a bamboo tube until even that small exchange with the world came to an end. This practice became known as Sokushin Butsu. To the monks who attempted it, the goal was spiritual transcendence, a final act of discipline in which the body would remain preserved after death as evidence of devotion. But beneath the spiritual frame lies a process of astonishing biological precision. Fat was reduced because fat decays. Moisture was driven down because moisture invites collapse. Internal conditions were altered long before death arrived. In effect, the body was prepared from within to resist the ordinary consequences of dying. That level of control could not have emerged from faith alone. Across generations, monks followed similar stages. They repeated the method knowing many attempts would fail. Some bodies endured, others did not. The successful cases became relics, quietly enthroned and venerated. The failures disappeared into burial and silence. But failure is still information. It teaches what the record often refuses to say directly. This was not a single miracle. It was a tradition refined through outcome. What makes Sokushin Butsu so haunting is its stillness. No ruler ordered it. No captive was forced into it. The experiment, if that is what we call it, was self-directed. And yet that does not make it simple. The body was still subjected to a severe and irreversible trial, one designed around observation, repetition, and a binary result: preservation or decay, success or disappearance. Here, ancient preservation takes on its most intimate form. The monk becomes both practitioner and subject, believer and evidence. He enters death not as surrender, but as a final procedure. And perhaps that is why these preserved figures disturb us even in their serenity. They suggest that the human desire to master mortality can become so inward, so disciplined, that the line between enlightenment and experiment nearly vanishes. When a person transforms himself into the proof of an idea, what remains at the end? Transcendence? Or the quiet record of a body pushed to its limit in search of meaning? What ties these distant worlds together? Not geography, not language, not empire. What binds them is a habit of mind that appears again and again across centuries. When human beings confront mystery, they begin to test it. In Egypt, the mystery was decay. In Qin China, it was mortality. In Greece, the interior map of the body. In Pontus, the chemistry of survival. In Rome, the mechanics of injury. Among the Maya, the threshold of altered consciousness. In the Aztec world, the calibrated power of plants. In ancient India, the possibility that damage might be reversed. In Japan, the hope that discipline could outwit decomposition from within. Different cultures, different beliefs, different moral worlds. And yet beneath them all runs the same quiet sequence. Observe, adjust, repeat. That sequence is older than science as we usually tell its story. We like to imagine knowledge arriving in clean rooms, under bright light, separated from superstition and violence by the steady advance of reason. But the deeper truth is less comforting. Much of what humanity learned first came through uncertainty, pain, ritual, risk, and bodies placed in situations where failure could not be hidden. Ancient people did not possess our instruments, but they understood pattern. They recognized that one outcome could be compared to another. They built practices around that insight, even when they described it through religion, kingship, medicine, or sacrifice. This does not make every ancient practice scientific in the modern sense, nor should it. Many were shaped by belief systems we no longer share. Many crossed boundaries we would now call intolerable. Some were compassionate, others were cruel. Most existed in a space where those categories blur. That is precisely what makes them feel so close to us. We too still struggle with the ethics of what may be learned, who bears the risk, and how progress is justified once it begins to work. So perhaps the real continuity is not technical, but human. Again and again, our species has stood before the unknown and refused to leave it untouched. We prod, preserve, poison, repair, endure, and record. We tell ourselves it is for healing, for wisdom, for transcendence, for safety. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is also for power. And often, the two are inseparable. When the past feels most distant, it can suddenly become most recognizable. Because in the end, these ancient experiments are not only about what our ancestors did, they are about a question that has never stopped following us. When knowledge asks something difficult of the body, who decides what price is acceptable? What history hands down to us is rarely the full story. We inherit the polished result, not the long uncertainty that made it possible. A preserved mummy behind museum glass appears complete, almost serene. An antidote formula passed through generations sounds like wisdom distilled. A surgical technique feels inevitable once it works. But inevitability is one of history's most convincing illusions. Behind every preserved body, every measured compound, every successful reconstruction, there were almost certainly attempts that failed quietly and were never meant to be remembered. The decomposed remains, the poisoned patient, the graft that darkened and died, the ritual that did not bring vision, the discipline that ended in ordinary decay. Failure, more than success, is what most often disappears. This is true in part because ancient knowledge was frequently guarded. Priests, court physicians, healers, royal advisors, and monastic communities did not always write for the public. What they knew moved through apprenticeship, secrecy, and restricted tradition. Knowledge was power, and power has always been selective about what it reveals. But there is another reason too. Human beings are drawn to outcomes that reassure us. We want the finished method, not the bodies that absorbed its uncertainty. And yet those absent figures remain the hidden architecture of discovery. To acknowledge them is not to flatten all of history into accusation. The ancient world was not modern, and its moral landscapes were shaped by beliefs, dangers, and necessities different from our own. Some experiments emerge from care, some from fear, some from devotion, some from domination. Most cannot be judged cleanly by a single standard, but neither should they be softened into legend. The cost matters, especially when the cost was human. That may be the most enduring lesson these stories offer. Knowledge is never only intellectual, it is embodied. It enters history through skin, breath, pain, tissue, hunger, toxins, scars. Before an idea becomes accepted, someone usually has to live inside its uncertainty, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. So when we look back at the ancient world, perhaps we should resist two temptations at once: the temptation to romanticize and the temptation to condemn too simply. Better to stay with the tension, better to admit that many of humanity's earliest insights came from places where reverence and intrusion, healing and harm, wisdom and obsession stood uncomfortably close together. And if the failures have been buried more thoroughly than the successes, perhaps the most honest thing we can do is remember that every breakthrough casts a shadow. History preserves the answer. It is up to us to imagine the many unanswered lives that made it possible. So where does this journey leave us? Not with a simple verdict on the ancient world, but with a deeper recognition of ourselves. Across centuries and civilizations, people stood before the same great silences that confront us now: death, pain, memory, healing, consciousness, time. They answered those silences with the tools they had available: ritual, discipline, trial, intuition, comparison. Sometimes their methods were beautiful in their care. Sometimes they were brutal in their cost. Often they were both at once. That is what makes these stories linger. They do not belong neatly to science or religion, cruelty or wisdom. They belong to the complicated territory where human beings try to understand what they are made of. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. The ancient past is not haunting because it is primitive. It is haunting because it is recognizable. The embalmers along the Nile, the physicians of plague-ridden Greece, the alchemists of imperial courts, the surgeons rebuilding damaged faces, the monks attempting to preserve themselves from within. They were all, in their own ways, confronting uncertainty through repeated acts of attention. They were asking the body questions and waiting to see how it answered. We still do that. Our instruments are more precise now, our language is more formal. Our ethical frameworks, however imperfect, are more visible. And yet the central dilemma has not disappeared. Every age must decide how far it is willing to go in the name of knowledge, safety, healing, or hope. Every age must ask who carries the risk, who receives the benefit, and what remains unspoken behind the success that history celebrates. Maybe that is why these ancient experiments still echo across time. They remind us that progress is never only a story of brilliance. It is also a story of limits tested, boundaries crossed, and meanings argued over long after the evidence is found. Beneath every preserved relic and every surviving text is a quieter human question. What were we willing to do in order to know? And perhaps the answer, then as now, is both inspiring and difficult to bear. We are a species driven by wonder. We are also a species willing to wound, endure, and transform in pursuit of it. Between those two truths lies the whole uneasy beauty of our history.